My name is Claire Whitfield, and I am 34 years old. A year after my sister woke up from a coma and decided I was the villain of her life, I was standing in the ballroom of the Millbrook Country Club, holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of finishing, when the woman who almost died right in front of me, the same woman I had spent 4 months keeping alive on paper while machines kept her alive in body, pointed a manicured finger at my chest and told 200 people that I had stolen her inheritance while she couldn't defend herself. "You signed my inheritance away while I was in a coma," Vanessa said, loud enough that the string quartet in the corner actually stopped playing. "You had power of attorney, and you used it to rob your own sister." The other guests had gone quiet around us, that specific hush of a crowded room sensing a spectacle it doesn't want to miss. And I could feel dozens of eyes moving between my sister's flushed, furious face and my own carefully composed one, waiting to see which of us would break first. I looked at my parents. My father, Richard Whitfield, was studying the bottom of his coffee cup like it contained the answer to a question he didn't want to ask out loud. My mother, Diane, was scrolling her phone, thumb moving in small, practiced circles, the way she always did when she wanted to be anywhere else but here. Neither of them looked at me. Neither of them looked at Vanessa either. They had perfected, over 30-some years, the art of being present and absent at the same time. I took a slow sip of my champagne. I let the bubbles sit on my tongue for longer than necessary. I smiled, faintly, the kind of smile that unsettles people more than screaming would. "Is that the story he sold you?" I asked. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Before she could recover, the ballroom doors swung open, and a man in a gray suit I didn't recognize walked in, flanked by 2 Millbrook PD officers, holding a folder with the county seal stamped on the front. He scanned the room once, found Vanessa's date at the head table. A man named Marcus Doyle, dressed like old money he'd never actually had, and said clearly, so the whole room could hear it, "Marcus Doyle? You're going to need to come with us." The color drained out of Vanessa's face so fast I could count the seconds. My mother finally looked up from her phone. My father set down his coffee cup. If you're watching this and you already have a guess about what happens next, drop it in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from and whether you believe karma serves cold, with a full paper trail attached. If you do, hit like, hit subscribe, because what happened in that ballroom was 4 months in the making, and I intend to walk you through every single day of it. Let's rewind to where it all started. I grew up in Millbrook, Connecticut, in a house with 2 staircases and 1 favorite child, and it was never me. My father built Whitfield Freight and Logistics from 4 trucks into a 112-truck regional carrier over 30 years, and by the time I was in high school, the family narrative had already calcified into something unmovable. Vanessa was the bright one, the charming one, the one who'd inherit the company and carry the Whitfield name into its next chapter. I was the quiet one, the careful one, the one who did well in school because, as my mother once put it at a dinner party while gesturing at me with her wine glass, someone has to keep the numbers straight. So I did. I became a forensic accountant. I built a career out of being the person companies called when they suspected an employee was quietly bleeding them dry. When a set of books looked clean on the surface but wrong underneath, in the way only someone trained to notice would catch. By 32, I was a senior forensic auditor at Pierce Whitmore and Associates, and my colleagues had started calling me the Ledger, half as a joke, half because I'd built a reputation for finding the one transaction in 10,000 that didn't belong. I liked the nickname. The numbers never lie. People lie. Numbers just wait for someone patient enough to ask them the right question. Vanessa, meanwhile, had gone through 3 semesters of business school before deciding formal education stifled her instincts, and had spent most of her 20s on the periphery of the family company in a series of vaguely titled positions: Director of Brand Partnerships, Head of Client Experience, that seemed to exist primarily so she'd have something on her business card. She was warm in the way that made rooms lean toward her, funny at dinner parties, effortlessly likable in the specific way that had never once, in my experience, correlated with actually being reliable. My parents didn't seem to mind that the correlation was missing. Every family has a story it tells itself, And ours was that Vanessa was a late bloomer with too much talent, in my experience, correlated with actually being reliable. My parents didn't seem to mind that the correlation was missing. Every family has a story it tells itself. And ours was that Vanessa was a late bloomer with too much talent to be constrained by conventional paths. And I was useful, reliable, the kind of daughter you didn't worry about, which in my family had always meant the kind of daughter you didn't think about much at all. I remember the exact scene that made the shape of things click into place for me. The way an auditor suddenly sees the pattern in a stack of invoices that looked random for weeks. It was my 28th birthday. My parents threw Vanessa an engagement party. She'd gotten engaged to a man named Trevor 3 weeks earlier, an engagement that would collapse within the year, and scheduled it for the same night as my birthday dinner, which they'd forgotten about entirely until I mentioned it 2 days before. My mother's solution was to combine the two events. "It'll be more fun this way," she said. "One big party instead of 2 small ones." I sat through a night of toasts to Vanessa and Trevor's future, my own birthday cake wheeled out as an afterthought near 11 p.m., half the guests already gone. And I understood, with the calm clarity of someone closing a file they'd been afraid to open, that I would never be the center of anything in this family. I decided that night that I didn't need to be. I would build something they couldn't take credit for and couldn't diminish. I would make myself so competent, so essential, so quietly indispensable, that eventually the numbers would speak for me even when my parents wouldn't. There was another scene from that same era of my life that I've never told anyone outside of a therapist's office, and I think it matters here, because it explains something about why I kept saying yes to my family long after any reasonable person would have started saying no. When I was 26, I caught an early discrepancy in Whitfield Freight's books during a slow Thanksgiving weekend. A pattern of duplicate invoices from a maintenance vendor that, extrapolated over 18 months, amounted to nearly $60,000 in overbilling. I brought it to my father quietly, without fanfare, the way I brought him everything. He thanked me, had the vendor contract terminated within the week, and recovered a partial refund through the vendor's insurance. It was, by any objective measure, the single most financially significant thing anyone in the family had done for the company that year. It was never mentioned again. 2 months later, at the company's holiday party, my father stood up and gave a toast about the next generation of Whitfield leadership. And the entire toast was about Vanessa, about her vision, her people skills, her future at the helm of the company. While I stood near the bar with a glass of wine I didn't drink and understood, for the first time with real clarity, that competence and recognition were not the same currency in this family, and that I had been mistakenly trying to spend one to buy the other for years. I want to be fair to my parents, because fairness has always mattered to me more than it probably should have, given how rarely it was returned. My father was not a cruel man. He built a company out of nothing, worked 60-hour weeks for 3 decades, and genuinely believed, in the uncomplicated way people believe things they've never had to examine closely, that he loved his daughters equally. My mother believed the same thing about herself, but belief and behavior are 2 different ledgers, and if you'd audited theirs, attention given, credit assigned, defense offered when one daughter attacked the other, the imbalance would have been undeniable to anyone willing to actually run the numbers. Nobody in my family had ever been willing to run those numbers except me. That, I would come to understand, was precisely the problem. The root of everything that happened later, the ballroom, the accusation, Marcus Doyle in handcuffs, traced back to a single moment 18 months before that gala. The night Vanessa's car went off Route 9 in a rainstorm at 11:40 p.m., 3 months after her divorce from Trevor was finalized. With a blood alcohol level the paramedics clocked at twice the legal limit. She hit a guardrail doing 60. She was in surgery for 6 hours. She was in a medically induced coma for 4 months after that, and for those 4 months, I was the only person in my family with the stomach, or the training, to look directly at what her accident had actually done to us. Not the emotional wreckage, the financial one. Because here is the thing nobody in my family wanted to say out loud in the hospital hallway. Vanessa's accident happened 3 weeks after my father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. At a moment when Whitfield Freight was already leaking cash from a bad fuel contract he'd signed the year before, without running the numbers past me. My mother was in no condition to manage a household budget, let alone a 112 truck company, and a comatose daughter's mounting medical bills, and a civil suit from the driver of the car Vanessa had clipped before hitting the guardrail. Someone had to hold power of attorney. Someone had to keep the company solvent, keep Vanessa's medical trust funded, and keep the family from being sued into the ground while she lay in a hospital bed unable to sign her own name. That someone was me. And I want you to remember that detail because it becomes very important later. I didn't take that power. My father handed it to me. In a hospital cafeteria, over coffee neither of us drank, because there was no one else in the room he trusted to do the math correctly. The 4 months Vanessa was in a coma were the busiest of my life, and I did the work the way I did everything, quietly, meticulously, without asking for credit. I restructured the fuel contract that was bleeding the company. I negotiated the civil suit from the guardrail incident down to a settlement the company's insurance could actually absorb instead of the 6-figure judgment the other driver's lawyer was threatening. I moved Vanessa's personal accounts into a protected trust so her existing debts, $23,000 in credit card balances, most of it run up in the 8 months after her divorce, couldn't attach to the medical trust my father had set up to cover her care. I did all of this using power of attorney documents that my father signed, that our family lawyer, a careful man named Alan Feldstein, who'd handled Whitfield business for 2 decades, drafted and notarized and filed with the county. And somewhere in month 3, a man named Marcus Doyle started showing up at the hospital. He told the nurses he was Vanessa's fiancé, though nobody in the family had ever met him or heard his name before that. He told my mother, in the waiting room, a story about how he and Vanessa had been quietly dating for 6 months before the accident and were planning to get engaged the week of the crash. He was charming, in the specific way con men are charming, attentive to my mother in a way my father hadn't been in years, quick with a compliment, quicker with a story that made him sound tragic and devoted at the same time. My mother starved for someone to lean on while her husband's hands had started to tremble and her daughter lay unconscious down the hall. Let him in. My father, medicated and exhausted, didn't have the energy to ask the questions I was asking. I asked them anyway. I ran a background check on Marcus Doyle, the way I'd run one on any new vendor my firm was about to hand a contract. What I found was 2 prior fraud charges in Rhode Island, both settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, a pattern of relationships with women recovering from major medical events or going through inheritance disputes, a LinkedIn profile that changed his job title every 8 months. I brought it to my father in the hospital cafeteria, the same table where he'd handed me power of attorney 3 months earlier, and he looked at the printout for a long time and then said, "Claire, your sister is in a coma. This isn't the moment." It was, I would learn later, exactly the moment, because while Vanessa couldn't speak for herself, Marcus Doyle spoke for her, constantly, and what he was quietly building, conversation by conversation, with my exhausted parents, was a version of events in which I, the sister with the power of attorney, the sister who'd moved money, restructured accounts, and locked down trusts while Vanessa slept, was not protecting the family. I was stealing from it. That was the root betrayal, not something I did, something a stranger constructed patiently in a hospital waiting room while the one person who could have contradicted him was unconscious. Vanessa woke up on a Tuesday in March. I remember because I was in a deposition for another case, and my mother called 4 times before I stepped out to answer, and when I did, all she said was, "She's awake. She's asking for you." Her voice cracking on the word "you" in a way that, for one brief, undeserved moment, made me believe I still mattered to this family in the specific way I'd always wanted to. I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in 4 months, some knot I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying since the night of the accident. I drove to the hospital straight from the deposition, still in my blazer, running red light adjacent through 3 intersections I would never normally have risked, and when I walked into her room, she was sitting up, thin and pale and disoriented. Tubes and monitors still tracking every function of a body that had spent 4 months learning to survive without her conscious participation. But awake. I drove to the hospital straight from the deposition, still in my blazer, running red light adjacent through 3 intersections I would never normally have risked. And when I walked into her room, she was sitting up, thin and pale and disoriented, tubes and monitors still tracking every function of a body that had spent 4 months learning to survive without her conscious participation. But awake, unmistakably, achingly awake, and she looked at me and smiled. Small, confused, but real. And for about 90 seconds, before Marcus Doyle walked in behind me with 2 coffees and a look on his face I should have read faster than I did, I let myself believe that whatever came next, whatever this accident had cost all of us, we would at least get through it as sisters, the way I'd quietly hoped we might for the entire 18 years since that forgotten birthday dinner. Marcus set the coffees down. He put his hand on Vanessa's shoulder like he owned it, and he said, in a voice built entirely for an audience, "Baby, there's something you need to know about what happened while you were out." I remember the first conversation I had with Marcus alone in the hospital's 5th floor vending machine alcove 4 days after Vanessa woke up. He'd followed me out there under the pretense of getting coffee, and he'd said that I mistook at the time for genuine concern. "I know this whole situation must have been so hard for you, managing everything alone, nobody thanking you for it." I remember feeling, briefly, grateful, because it was, genuinely, the first time in 4 months had cost me. I told him some of it, the night spent reconciling accounts after 12-hour workdays, the fuel contract negotiation I'd handled over a hospital cafeteria table, the civil suit I'd settled while sitting in a plastic chair outside the ICU. He listened, nodded, said all the right things. I didn't know yet that everything I told him that afternoon would resurface, weeks later, twisted into evidence of how much control I'd seized while Vanessa was helpless. I had handed him the raw material for the case against me with my own mouth, because I mistook a stranger's attentiveness for kindness. The same mistake I'd later realize that both my mother and my sister were making at the exact same time, in the exact same hallway. I want to be clear about something, because this detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Vanessa did not accuse me the moment she woke up. It took him 6 weeks. 6 weeks of hospital visits where he was the one explaining her own financial situation back to her. 6 weeks of him sitting with her lawyer, a lawyer he'd recommended, a lawyer I'd later find out he had a financial relationship with, walking her through trust documents she was too exhausted and too medicated to read closely herself. 6 weeks of him saying, over and over, in different words each time, "Doesn't it seem strange that your sister had all this control and you ended up with less than you thought you had?" The story was, while she lay helpless in a hospital bed, her sister, the accountant, the one who was always so good with numbers, so trusted, so quiet, had used a legal loophole to restructure the family trust in her own favor, cut Vanessa's inheritance percentage from 40% to 12%, and move controlling shares of Whitfield Freight into an account Claire alone administered. None of that was true. What was true was that I had moved Vanessa's shares into a protective trust that could not be touched by creditors or civil judgments until she was well enough to manage them herself. A trust that, on paper, listed me as administrator for exactly this reason, with an expiration clause the moment she was medically cleared. Her 40% was still 40%. It had simply been protected from $23,000 of credit card debt and a lawsuit that could have taken the guardrail settlement straight out of her share. I had saved her inheritance. Marcus Doyle told her I had stolen it, and my parents, desperate for someone to blame for 4 months of chaos they hadn't had the strength to manage themselves, decided it was easier to believe him than to sit with what they'd actually asked of me. That was the setup. Now let me tell you what it cost me to prove it. The first blow landed 9 days after Vanessa was discharged from the hospital. I got a call from Alan Feldstein, our family lawyer for 2 decades, who told me, but firmly, that Vanessa's new attorney had filed a petition with the county probate court to review my conduct as power of attorney, alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, watching the coffee maker finish its cycle, thinking, 48 hours. That's how long I have before this becomes public record. Claire, Alan said, and I could hear how uncomfortable he was. A man who drafted my father's will and handled 2 generations of Whitfield legal business, reduced to delivering news he clearly didn't believe. I want you to know, I told them this was going to blow up in everyone's face. The paperwork you filed was clean. I reviewed every page of it myself before your father signed off. Whoever's advising her doesn't seem to care about that. Who is advising her? I asked. A lawyer named Priya Anand. New name to me. Aggressive. She's framing this as urgent. Vulnerable adult exploitation, needs immediate court intervention, that kind of language. It'll get a hearing fast. I called my father that night. I asked him to simply tell the truth, that he'd handed me power of attorney himself, in front of witnesses, for exactly the reasons I'd used it. He was quiet for a long moment and then said, Claire, I don't want to get in the middle of this. You girls need to work it out. I remember the word girls. I was 33 years old and my sister was 31, and my father called us girls, the same way he had when we were 8 and 6 and fighting over a swing set, as if what was happening now was a sibling squabble instead of a legal accusation that could end my career. Dad, I said, keeping my voice level even though something in my chest had started to shake. This isn't a disagreement about who gets the bigger bedroom. There's a county filing with my name on it that says I exploited a vulnerable adult. That's a felony allegation. I need you to be a witness to what actually happened. I know this is stressful, he said, in the placating tone he used on vendors he was about to disappoint. But I can't be seen taking sides. Not right now. Not with your sister still recovering. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time, and I understood, in that moment, something I would spend the next 3 months confirming over and over. My father was never going to protect me by telling the truth. He was going to protect his own comfort by staying silent, and he had decided, somewhere in the calculus he wasn't willing to say out loud, that my career and my reputation were an acceptable cost for his peace. The petition became public record within a week, and forensic accounting is a small, reputation-driven world. Within 11 days, the managing partner at Pierce Whitmore and Associates, a soft-spoken man named Harold Voss, who I'd always considered something close to a mentor, called me into his office and told me, not unkindly, that a client had raised concerns after seeing the filing online, and that until the matter was resolved, I'd be moved off active engagements and placed on administrative review, a suspension by another name, full pay for now, but no cases, no client contact, and an unmistakable message that the firm's confidence in me had a limit, and I'd found it. This isn't a judgment on your character, Claire, Harold said, not quite meeting my eyes. You understand the position we're in. We handle sensitive financial matters for clients who need to trust the people managing them. A pending exploitation allegation, whatever the merits, creates exposure we can't ignore. I've built this firm's forensic practice for 14 years, I said. I've never had a single complaint, not one. I know, he said. I'm sorry. I remember thinking, sitting across from him, that the 2 words, I'm sorry, had become the currency of my entire life that month, offered freely, backed by nothing, changing nothing. I had spent 14 years building a reputation for precision, for the specific kind of trust that comes from never once being wrong about a number, and it had taken 11 days and an unproven allegation to make that reputation conditional. I sat in my car in the parking garage after that meeting for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I remember thinking, with the same cold clarity I brought to every audit, they haven't proven anything. They've just made accusing me cheaper than defending me. That's not justice. That's just leverage. Somewhere in that garage, staring at the concrete pillar in front of my windshield, I thought about my old nickname, the Ledger, and I thought, with something between grief and resolve, that a ledger doesn't argue with anyone. It doesn't plead. It doesn't ask to be believed. It just sits there, accurate, until someone is finally willing to read it. I decided in that parking garage to stop trying to be believed and start building something no one could argue with. I had 11 days before the probate court would hold its first hearing. The clock had started, and I understood, sitting in that garage, that from here forward, I wasn't going to win this by being patient and hoping the truth surfaced on its own. I was going to have to build the case myself, the same way I built every forensic audit, one document at a time, until the pattern was undeniable, even to people who badly wanted not to see it. The first thing I did was pull every financial record from the 4 months of my power of attorney and organize them into a timeline no one could argue with. Bank statements, trust filings, the fuel contract renegotiation, the civil settlement paperwork, all of it time-stamped. All of it cross-referenced against my father's original authorization. The numbers never lie. I just needed enough of them, arranged clearly enough, that even a probate judge unfamiliar with our family's particular brand of dysfunction could see the shape of what actually happened. The second thing I did was start digging into Marcus Doyle. I want to walk you through the next several weeks in order, because each one stripped something else away from me, and by the time I understood how deliberate the whole thing was, I'd already lost more than I ever expected to. 11 days after the probate petition was filed, the hearing happened, and it did not go the way I'd hoped. I stood in a small county courtroom in a gray blazer I'd chosen specifically because it made me look calm, competent, unremarkable. The opposite of whatever image financial exploiter conjured in a stranger's mind. Vanessa's attorney, a sharp, aggressive litigator named Priya Anand, who I'd later learn had been retained on Marcus's recommendation and was being quietly compensated through a referral arrangement I couldn't yet prove, stood and painted a picture of me that I barely recognized as belonging to my own life. "Your Honor," Priya said, pacing in front of the bench with the practiced rhythm of someone who did this daily. "We have a woman recovering from a catastrophic accident, still regaining her cognitive footing, whose sister, a professional forensic accountant, someone trained specifically to understand the mechanics of financial control, restructured trust accounts, renegotiated company contracts, and repositioned controlling assets. All while my client had no capacity whatsoever to consent, object, or even understand what was happening to her own inheritance. This is not a family disagreement. This is precisely the kind of exploitation vulnerable adult statutes exist to prevent." Dorothy Kim, I'd retained her the week before, on Alan Feldstein's recommendation, rose and pointed out correctly that every action I'd taken had been under written, notarized authorization from my father, the sole trustee at the time, and that the actions themselves, protecting Vanessa's share from a lawsuit and from her own credit card debt, had demonstrably benefited her financially. Judge Marsh, a cautious woman who clearly wanted to avoid any appearance of favoring one sister over another before she'd had time to review the underlying documents herself, split the difference in the way judges often do when they're not yet ready to rule on the merits. "I'm not making findings on misconduct today," she said. "But given the seriousness of what's alleged, and given that Ms. Whitfield the Younger is still in active recovery, I think the prudent course is to freeze the accounts in question and order an independent forensic review before anyone's access is restored." She looked at me, not unkindly. "This isn't a punishment, Ms. Whitfield. It's a pause, so we can all be certain." It didn't feel like a pause. It felt like the floor dropping out from under a house I'd spent 4 months holding up with my bare hands. My access was frozen. 24 hours before that hearing, I had been the only person actively managing the accounts that kept Whitfield Freight solvent. 24 hours after, I had no access to any of it, and neither, notably, did anyone competent. Because my father, still managing his Parkinson's diagnosis and increasingly leaning on Vanessa and Marcus for help, had not yet named a replacement. 48 hours after that, the company's fuel supplier called me directly, old habit, they'd worked with me for 4 months, to say a scheduled payment hadn't gone through. I had to explain, humiliated, that I no longer had access to authorize it. I called my father. He said Marcus was handling things now. I hung up and sat very still for a long time because I understood, with the clean, cold understanding of someone reading a balance sheet, that Marcus Doyle was not trying to punish me for something I'd done. He was trying to get control of the accounts I'd spent 4 months protecting, and Vanessa's accusation was the tool, not the goal. 3 weeks in, the ticking clock sharpened. The court set a date for the full asset review, 60 days out, and made clear that if the independent audit found any evidence of misconduct on my part, the probate court would move to permanently strip me of any fiduciary role in the family trust and refer the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. 60 days. I wrote it on a sticky note and put it on my bathroom mirror, the way I used to write case deadlines at the office, because I needed to see it every morning to remember that this wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was a countdown. Week 4 brought an obstacle I hadn't anticipated at all. My own hometown turning into an audience. Vanessa, coached by Marcus or simply carried by her own hurt, posted a long, emotional message to her personal social media page. No names used, but no ambiguity either, given that half of Millbrook had known both of us since grade school. Describing, watching someone I trusted use my darkest moment against me, and asking her followers to please understand if I need space from certain family members right now. The post collected over 400 comments within 2 days, most of them sympathetic messages from people who had no idea what had actually happened, several of them explicitly naming me in the comments. One from a woman I'd gone to high school with that read, simply, "Some people will do anything for money, even to family. So sad." I read every comment. I don't know why I put myself through that, except that some stubborn part of me kept hoping one of them would ask a question instead of assuming an answer. None of them did. I called Vanessa directly that week, before the restraining order made that impossible, and asked her, as calmly as I could manage, to take the post down, or at least to talk to me before she said anything else publicly. She didn't answer. Marcus did, on speakerphone, in the background telling her what to say, and what came through the line was a version of my sister's voice that sounded rehearsed. "I don't think we have anything to talk about until the court sorts this out," she said. "I have to protect myself." I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, thinking, protect yourself from what exactly? From the sister who spent 4 months keeping your inheritance intact while you couldn't speak for yourself. I didn't say that out loud. I'd learned by then that anything I said would be relayed, filtered, and reshaped before it reached anyone who mattered. So I hung up, and I went back to my documents, because the documents, unlike my sister's phone calls, could not be talked out of the truth. Week 5 brought the first public confrontation. My mother hosted what she called a family reconciliation dinner, an idea I now believe Marcus suggested to her, because it gave him a controlled setting to further poison the well. And I made the mistake of attending because some small, stubborn part of me still believed that if I sat across from my parents and my sister and simply laid out the documents calmly, they would see reason. I brought a folder. I did not raise my voice once. I sat at the same dining table where we'd eaten 1,000 family meals, under the same chandelier my mother had picked out when I was 12, and I walked them through the trust restructuring, the civil settlement, the fuel contract, every document dated and initialed by my father in his own handwriting. "This is the authorization," I said, sliding the page across the table toward my father. "Your signature, dated the day after Vanessa's surgery. You asked me to protect the company and protect her inheritance. That's exactly what I did." My father looked at the page for a long moment. He didn't pick it up. "I don't remember signing that," he said quietly, and I felt something in my chest go very cold, because I understood, watching him, that he might genuinely have believed what he just said, that 4 months of stress and an undiagnosed cognitive fog from his medication had blurred the memory into something more convenient than the truth. Or he was lying to avoid conflict. I still don't know which, and I've decided it doesn't much matter, because the effect on me was identical either way. "Dad, Alan notarized it. He was in the room." "I'm not saying you're lying," he said, in the tone of a man who was, in fact, implying exactly that. "I'm just saying it's a lot to keep straight." Vanessa, coached, I now believe, by Marcus in the car on the way over, interrupted me 4 times to say some version of the same accusation dressed in different words. "This is exactly the kind of manipulation she's good at," she said at one point, not looking at me but at our mother, as if I were a case study rather than a person sitting across the table. She can make anything sound reasonable. That's the whole problem. That's what makes it so hard to prove. I'm showing you the actual documents, Vanessa, I said. Not a story. Documents. You had 4 months alone with everything, she said. Of course the documents say whatever you needed them to say. I felt the specific, disorienting vertigo of being accused of forging my own paper trail by someone who had never once looked at a single page of it. My father excused himself from the table twice. Once for water he didn't drink, once for a phone call I later learned didn't exist. My mother cried, not out of sympathy for either of us, I realized, but out of pure exhaustion at being in the room at all. Her hands pressed flat against the table like she could hold the whole conversation still through sheer physical pressure. Marcus sat beside Vanessa with his hand over hers, saying almost nothing all evening, watching me across the table with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. The look of a man watching a plan execute exactly as designed. Near the end of the night, as I gathered my folder to leave, my mother said, not quite meeting my eyes, "Can't you just let her have some peace of mind, Claire? Even if you're right. Does it matter that much to be right?" I stood in the doorway of my parents' house, folder under my arm, and I thought about 14 years of being right and unthanked, 4 months of being right and unpaid, and now this. Being asked to simply set the truth down for the comfort of people who had never once set anything down for me. "It matters to me," I said, and I left. I drove home that night, having accomplished nothing except confirming, once and for all, that the facts alone were not going to save me. My family had already decided which story was easier to live with, and my folder of documents wasn't going to out-argue their exhaustion. I understood, driving through the dark with my hands steady on the wheel and my chest anything but, that from here forward I would need something louder than a folder. I would need a room full of witnesses and a stranger's signature on an independent report, because apparently my own family's memory could be talked out of the truth, but a notarized court document couldn't. Week 7, I lost my apartment. Not directly, but the lease had been co-signed by my father 2 years earlier as a favor when I was between jobs, back before I had built up enough credit history on my own, and with the family relationship in open legal war, he withdrew as co-signer, which triggered a requalification clause in my lease that my landlord, unwilling to deal with the complication, used as an excuse not to renew. When I called my father to ask why, he said, "Alan advised me to limit my financial exposure until the court sorts this out." And I understood that financial exposure now apparently included his own daughter's housing. I found a smaller place across town within 12 days, boxes half unpacked for a month, because there wasn't time to do it properly. Every hour I wasn't working, I was building my case. We were sitting at the small kitchen table in the new apartment, the one still half full of unopened boxes, when he finally said it. "I love you, Claire. I need you to know that first." He turned his water glass slowly on the table, not looking at me. "But I don't know how to be with someone who's fighting a war I can't help her win. Every conversation we have turns into you explaining a document to me. I miss talking to you about anything else. I don't think there's been an anything else in 3 months. I'm trying to save my life," I said. "This is what that looks like right now." "I know," he said. "That's exactly the problem. I don't think there's room for me in it while it looks like this." I didn't fight him on it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 3 months doing math instead of feeling anything, understood that he wasn't wrong exactly. I had become someone who reconciled bank statements at 2 in the morning and flinched at unknown phone numbers and rehearsed courtroom testimony in the shower. I wasn't sure I recognized the version of myself he'd fallen in love with either. I remember thinking, in the numb, procedural part of my brain that had learned to keep functioning no matter what, one more asset gone. Recalculate. I packed his things into 3 boxes over the following weekend, and I noticed, folding the sweater he always left at my place, that I didn't cry until he was already gone, and even then it felt less like grief and more like relief that there was one less person in my life whose disappointment I had to manage, while everything else was on fire. Week 9, Ethan left. My fiancé of 2 years, a structural engineer I'd been with since before any of this started, had been quiet and supportive for the first 2 months. But the strain of a public probate case, a suspended career, a canceled lease, and a fiancé who was awake at 2 a.m. every night cross-referencing bank statements had worn something down in him that I hadn't noticed wearing. We were sitting at the small kitchen table in the new apartment, the one still half full of unopened boxes, when he finally said it. I love you, Claire. I need you to know that first. He turned his water glass slowly on the table, not looking at me. But I don't know how to be with someone who's fighting a war I can't help her win. Every conversation we have turns into you explaining a document to me. I miss talking to you about anything else. I don't think there's been anything else in 3 months. I'm trying to save my life, I said. This is what that looks like right now. I know, he said. That's exactly the problem. I don't think there's room for me in it while it looks like this. I didn't fight him on it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 3 months doing math instead of feeling anything, understood that he wasn't wrong exactly. I had become someone who reconciled bank statements at 2 in the morning and flinched at unknown phone numbers and rehearsed courtroom testimony in the shower. I wasn't sure I recognized the version of myself he'd fallen in love with either. I remember thinking, in the numb procedural part of my brain that had learned to keep functioning no matter what. One more asset gone. Recalculate. I packed his things into 3 boxes over the following weekend, and I noticed, folding the sweater he always left at my place, that I didn't cry until he was already gone. And even then it felt less like grief and more like relief that there was one less person in my life whose disappointment I had to manage while everything else was on fire. Week 11 brought the direct physical confrontation, and it happened at, of all places, the grocery store. I ran into Vanessa in the parking lot of the Millbrook Whole Foods on an ordinary Thursday evening, both of us alone, both of us caught off guard, and whatever composure Marcus had coached into her in public settings evaporated the moment she saw me without him standing beside her. You, she said, and I watched her whole body change, her shoulders squaring, her hands curling at her sides. You have some nerve shopping in this town like nothing happened. Vanessa, I don't want to do this here. Of course you don't. You never want to do anything where people can actually see you. She crossed the lot fast, faster than I expected from someone 11 weeks post-hospital, and before I fully registered what was happening, she'd grabbed the strap of my bag hard enough that I stumbled against my own car door. You took everything, she screamed, loud enough that 2 other shoppers stopped near the cart return to stare. You've always been like this, cold, calculating, no heart, exactly like Dad always said behind your back. And I should have just died in that car instead of waking up to this, to you, to all of it. I saved your inheritance, I said, my voice shaking now despite every effort to keep it level. I saved the company. I saved you from a lawsuit that would have taken everything you actually had. Ask Dad's own lawyer. Ask anyone who actually looked at the paperwork instead of listening to your boyfriend. Don't talk about Marcus, she said, and shoved me, hard enough that I hit the side mirror of my car. A store employee, a young man in a green apron who'd clearly clocked the situation from the cart corral, jogged over and physically stepped between us, asking if everyone was okay, if he needed to call someone. Vanessa was crying by then, the specific kind of crying that comes from adrenaline more than grief, and she turned and walked away across the lot without looking back. I stood there shaking, groceries forgotten on the pavement beside me, while the employee asked if I wanted him to call the police. I said no. I wish in hindsight that I'd said yes, because it would have created a contemporaneous record of who had actually initiated the confrontation, a detail that mattered enormously 2 weeks later, when Priya Anand filed for a restraining order describing this exact incident as evidence of my escalating harassment of her client. Someone in the lot filmed part of it on their phone. Not the beginning, not Vanessa crossing the lot or grabbing my bag, Just the tail end, my raised voice and her tears, and a blurry, out-of-context clip circulated on a Millbrook community Facebook group within a day, captioned with a second-hand version of Vanessa's story. By the following morning, it had over 200 shares. For the first time, I understood, viscerally, what it felt like to have my hometown, a place I'd lived my whole life, gone to school with half its residents, been a bridesmaid at a dozen of their weddings, quietly decide, based on 40 seconds of shaky video with no context, that they knew exactly who I was.